I think by the time we did that interview, I had started seeing a therapist because end of December 2019, I had this like weird bread roll. I mean, I don't know what I'm saying this for the podcast recording. There's no way these fucking geeks haven't all prepped for this interview by listening to all my previous appearances. It's weird to do a show where the audience is more prepared than the host. But yeah, I had this thing where somebody threw a bread roll at me, and it made the news, and the bread roll thing itself was funny. Like, and I just did a whole show. I just toured a whole show about this for last year, and like the thing that I always want to make clear is like the incident was funny. And like afterwards, I went to the pub with John Robbins and Tim Key and Chris Addison and a bunch of comedians who'd been at the event. And we all found it quite funny. Yeah. And then when the Telegraph picked it up, the vibe shifted. Yeah. Because then suddenly it's like, when something happens in a room at a comedy gig, whether it's good or bad, it exists in that moment. Like, and whatever happens, there's like there's an honesty to an audience's reaction, whether it's positive or negative. And you sort of take that slightly as being part of an occupational hazard. Like, I don't think, the man should not have thrown a bread roll at me. I don't think that is. You shouldn't, like, throw things at people or, like, put your hands on them in any way. But if you're in an audience, you are entitled to boo. And that's part of the deal of being a comedian. But the problem was then, when it became a news story, I started to get, like, death threats. And at the time, you sort of move through it and you think, well, everything's fine. And then sort of a couple of months later, I was sort of unable to, like, regulate my emotions. Like, there would just be points where people would say something to me, and then suddenly you couldn't stop. Like, it was like I was, like, drowning and, like, trying to catch my breath. And, like, eventually, my girlfriend and Brett Goldstein were like, you have to see a therapist. Like, Amy is my partner's name. I don't know why I was just trying to cover it. This is all Googleable information. When I started doing the MASH Report, which is a topical show on the BBC, and I started, the coverage was really weird. It wasn't this is a good comedy show or this is a bad comedy show. It was like, this should not exist and this man should not be allowed on the BBC saying those things. Amy at the time was like, I mean, the tone of it, that's what they said. It was pretty clear what they meant. I think so. It was pretty clear. Someone shut this loud packy up. Like, that was definitely in the subtext of some of the pieces. Yes. But at the time, Amy was like, I think you should see, like, a therapist, because this is not really a normal thing that you're going to go through, I think, if it continues like this. Yeah. And I was like, shut up. Shut up. Come on, I know. Because it felt indulgent to be like, oh, the TV show I host is making it difficult. And it did feel indulgent. But she was, of course, like, absolutely right. And I could have saved myself a lot of trouble if I had been, like, been in some sort of mental health care process from the start of the thing. But then, basically, I started seeing a therapist, and, like, within 2 hours, she was like, you got PTSD, my friend. Like, this is post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's like a very, like, mild but very textbook case of PTSD. Right. And so I did a lot of sort of therapy, and I still continue to do it. And it really helped me. So I think by the time we spoke about it, I did stand-up a little bit about it in the, like, 1 month where there was stand-up. Yes. Like, January 2020. Like, I don't know what happened after that, but for some reason, my voice memos app really dries up. But I did some stand-up about it, and I listened back to the stand-up when I started putting the material together for the tour, and there's a point where I can't talk about the death threats. I start talking about it on stage, and you hear me go, and then I got some death anyway, and you like, I can't engage on it. Yeah. But I think by the time we had a conversation about it, I'd started the process of being in therapy. Yeah. But it was weird because you lose the ability to, like, someone would say something pretty innocuous, and then I suddenly start feeling teary. It's really, really, it's quite strange. I will say this, Iron Man 3 is quite a good depiction of PTSD. Yeah. But yeah, it was a weird It was a weird thing.
And so was there any point, because there's a part of me, you know, I think looking back at my whole career as a comedian, because being a comedian is pretty stressful. Like, there's lots of times when you're down, you know, up and down. I think, like, with the Edinburgh Fringe, I look back and I think a lot of the time at the Edinburgh Fringe, I was properly, like, full on, not just unhappy. I was depressed for a week in the middle, like, properly.
Yeah, but that's because you'd given yourself a fucking Hitler mustache.
There was that. I mean, no, but that was sort of tough. But I've always sort of resisted the idea. Well, I feel like I talk about it through the shows. So I process stuff through the shows. But I've I kind of always felt like, do I want to go to a therapist who might, you know, sort me out, but then might also make me not funny? Was there any element of that you worried about?
Honestly, probably there was a part of that in my head.
Yeah.
But that's evidence enough that I needed to see it, because that is evidence of very disordered thinking. I might, and actually one of the things that I realised was that it's easier for me to write comedy about something that I've processed with a professional.
Yes.
Like, it's easier to be funny about something that you have. There's this thing in movies where they show stand-ups and they're like, and then one night, the stand-up comedian just got on stage and told the truth and it changed lives. And you're like, that would never happen. And if you did that, you would fucking bomb. Like, you would die so badly. Like, there's a Richard Pryor, obviously the DVDs available of Richard Pryor are largely like, you know, because he was this sort of like Bill Cosby style comedian who was like telling these kind of like funny stories about his life, but not really actually engaging with his autobiography. Then he's on stage at a gig and he has this kind of moment where he's like, I can't do this anymore. So then he goes to Berkeley and becomes immersed in like radical black politics. And the Richard Pryor stand-up that we all know, because that's what's on the DVD, is the stuff after that kind of Damascene moment. There's an album called Richard Pryor, which is catching him in the process of becoming that comedian.
Right.
But a more interesting document is Live and Smoking, which is just like one camera filming him as he's in the midpoint of his transition. And it's so weird because he is having a bad gig. And the audience is really uncomfortable. And he's talking about watching his mum, like his mother was a sex worker, and he was talking about watching his mum with Johns coming in, and like the audience, you can feel the entire audience will be like, Jesus fucking Christ. Like, they're so on edge. And you're like, that's what would happen in a movie if a comedian was like, I'm going to tell the truth. The audience would be like, fucking hell, we are so goddamn uncomfortable. So I found it easier to do comedy when I'd put some distance on it and I had some perspective on what had happened.
Yeah.
And then it was easier for me to write jokes.
Cool. Yeah, well, you know, but I think it's interesting to the extent. I saw Alan Davis talking about this, but, you know, like comedians these days, like, are being diagnosed and, you know, and are talking about this stuff, whereas clearly most of the comedians that from the 90s and way before, and certainly the 80s, were going through some massive mental problems and just never processing it.
No, but they were real men.
Yeah.
And they did what real men do: take cocaine and be mean to their wives. We were talking backstage.
Yeah.
And you were saying that you were thinking about possibly putting some material together about, you know, about cancer.
Yeah.
And you've written a book about how did you find that easy? Was that difficult to do?
It was actually, it was weird last year. So obviously it was 2021 when I went through it all, and 2022, just the beginning and the end of 2021-22, when I wrote the book. And it was very quick.
Yeah.
Because I'd written a blog, but I hadn't really written about the cancer in the blog for most of it. But it gave me like all the things I've been doing. So, you know, because it was mostly just autobiography, I kind of got down, and it was really helpful. But I think then I got my mild PTSD as a result of going through it. Yeah. Because then I became very paranoid about it coming back, which I hadn't really been. And I did struggle a bit after writing the book. But going through it all again was helpful, but equally it sort of made me like quite, PTSD, I think, in a very, very, very mild.
I talked to my therapist about this idea that, like, if you do comedy or you make any sort of culture about something, it's like an act of therapy. And she was like, it's the complete opposite of that. Because she was saying, like, if you're talking about something that you haven't processed your emotions around, you're just forcing yourself to relive the traumatic event, and you're not really putting any distance behind it.